Linked by the common desire to create bodies that possess improbable intellectual and physical capabilities, such films and the scientific philosophy of transhumanism at their center testify to the inexorable drive to achieve human perfection, while also mining the anxieties of what Isaac Asimov dubbed the Frankenstein complex, the fear that science will create something it cannot control, a monstrous being capable of supplanting its creators. In both Glazer's and Garland's films, that anxiety is also tied to the transhuman subjects' concomitant adoption and refusal of gender binaries, with both narratives presenting trans subjects as threats to masculine power and desire. Challenging a more optimistic transhumanist discourse, recent Gothic science fiction presents the cyborg and the humanoid as abject bodies due both to how they define expectations for gendered behavior and how they muddy definitions of the human. Lastly, Miller maintains that Gothic science fiction expresses anxieties resulting from its destabilizing of identities, its literal erasure of the human subject, and its exploration of the apocalyptic potential of technologies. These films suggest, Miller argues, that the fear of the transhuman stems, in part, from some of the same reactionary ideologies often used to stigmatize the transgender body. Extending Halberstam's argument in Skin shows that the late 20th century, late 1900s, Gothic exemplifies the contemporary desire for sexually explicit, shocking images of the body. Miller reads both the trans bodies of Under the Skin and Ex Machina as totalizing monsters much like those that dominate Gothic fiction and so much transhumanist science fiction. Functioning as amalgamations of bodies that muddy distinctions of class, gender, and sexuality, these film subjects insist on their separation from and link to the human, using their trans bodies to highlight the human body's own alienness and to reveal how the very definition of humanness functions as a tool for marginalizing non-normative bodies. The second chapter on Gothic film is Anson Cochrane's Gothic Gender in Skin Suits, or The Transgender Skin I Live In, which takes up Miller's fascinating engagement with skin theory in its discussion of Pedro Almodovar's 2011 film The Skin I Live In, La Piel que Habito. Much like Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs 20 years earlier, which contained a disclaimer in the film's dialogue itself, The Skin I Live In, Cochrane argues, is and is not about transgender. In terms of plot, these films are not claiming to offer depictions of trans characters, but of a serial killer skinning his victims for a woman suit in the former, and a rapist turned into a physical copy of his victim's deceased mother as punishment in the latter. In fact, these brief character descriptions already suggest why these films are seemingly hostile places for an exploration of skin as a transgender trope. However, Cochrane's chapter looks to these films not to chastise negative or inaccurate representations, nor to find positive images of transsexual characters or transgender narratives, but to argue that these films lay bare the underlying cultural logics of the metonymical relationship between skin, as visible sex, and gender. Intersecting with Miller's reading of skin and gender, Cochrane's analysis of these two films shows how skin is legible as a trope of gender dysphoria, even in these films that draw their Gothic horror from literalizing the skin metaphor and seemingly dislodging it from transgender narratives. From the fantasy of a seamless skin suit in Silence to the multiple layers of Gothic imprisonment in a house, in a room, in a new skin, in a trans-surgical body, in feminine clothes, in Skin's tour de force through the tropes of gender, these films are elaborate stagings of ideas of skin as clothing and of gender as a bodysuit. Invoking Halberstam's conception of seamlessness, Cochrane argues that the murderer who wants a woman suit treats the skin as gender. This seamlessness is not just the fantasy of a fictional serial killer character, it is an integral part of how gender is mapped onto the body as sex, in a much larger cultural fantasy. Skin consequently presents us with a seamless, suit of, replacement skin. Seamlessness means not showing marks of construction. It means a skin that bears no marks of surgery or violence. Seamlessness naturalizes the identity that skin is supposed to mark as coherent and closed. Buffalo Bill's woman suit and Vera's new skin, in their Gothic difference, illustrate the way in which, when it comes to gender, Skin is only ever the wrong body. Drawing on skin theorists Claudia Benthian and Stephen Connor, Cochrane brilliantly analyzes these films alongside examples from trans memoirs, Joy Layden, Aaron Raslink, and transgender studies, Jay Prosser, Bobby Noble, to explain how these ideas shape the way skin functions as a trope of gender dysphoria in trans rhetorics. Transgothic rhetorics. Cochrane's investigation of trans rhetorics is taken up by the chapters in the last section, which shift discussions of Gothic and transgender, trans embodiments, in the trans-Gothic body in Gothic literature and culture to a wider, malleable trans approach that theorizes literature, media, genre, and geopolitics. All of the chapters engage trans as signifying across, between, and mobile, in order to proffer the capabilities and capaciousness of trans. With these varied approaches, Transgothic rhetoric points to the possibilities of deontologizing and deterritorializing the Gothic. The chapters in this section acknowledge that Gothic is the interstices between genres. It is definable in its indefinability and categorized by its unconventional conventions. As its critics have historically recognized, Gothic cultural productions shape the canon in a suitably palimpsestic, mobile fashion. This section's chapters compellingly explore these mobilities and methods. Chapter 8, Jason Whittaker's The Media of Madness, Gothic Transmedia and the Cthulhu Mythos, explores transmedia swarming via the Lovecraft mythos, which has mutated across various media. Whittaker's chapter uses the insights of theorists such as Henry Jenkins and others working on transmedia, in combination with Jesse Parika's notion of insect media, a post-human approach to media ecologies that emphasizes the swarming and contagious nature of cultural exchange. As Glenys Byron and Dale Townshend have suggested, swarming is a recurrent chronotype in Gothic fiction, as zombies, vampires, clones, and viruses operate as mobile, deterritorialized, and ferocious agents across threatening, non-human networks. One example of such transmedia swarming is via the Lovecraft mythos which, aside from the original works by H.P. Lovecraft, has mutated across various media, including comics, Michael Nelson's Fall of Cthulhu, Alan Moore's The Courtyard, games, Call of Cthulhu, Arkham Horror, and video games, Alone in the Dark series, Dead Space, movies, Dragon, Event Horizon, and mobile platforms, The Wasted Lands, Moons of Madness. While other Gothic franchises offer more coherent examples of transmedia storytelling, notably Batman and Resident Evil, they also operate more closely as carefully controlled IPs. Whittaker compellingly argues that the Cthulhu mythos offers an example of how the distortions, mutations, and contagions of swarming media can manifest themselves across multiple media. Whittaker's examination of the deployment of Gothic transmedia via a mutating Lovecraft is next compounded with an assessment of Gothic as transgenre. Hannah Priest's Black Weddings and Black Mirrors, Gothic as transgeneric mode, contributes to the understanding of Gothic genre as modification. In an examination of literary text, David Richter has argued the Gothic should be understood as a mode rather than a genre. In such an analysis, the Gothic functions not as a set of generic structural or narrative elements, but rather as a designation of characteristic tonal and aesthetic features that work to modify or qualify a particular genre. John Froh argues that, while the genre of Gothic romance is now exhausted, the Gothic lives on as a mode and should be understood as an adjectival qualification of other genres, such as horror, mystery, and romance. Priest thereby examines the notion of Gothic as a transgeneric, adjectival mode in contemporary literature, film, and television. Specifically, the chapter explores the ways in which tonal and aesthetic features of the Gothic act in modification of particular formal and structural features. As contrasting case studies, the use of the Gothic in the paranormal romance literary subgenre and in dystopian science fiction television are explored by Priest. The chapter maintains that the Gothic mode does indeed function to modify and qualify features of these subgenres. However, A consideration of examples from different contexts and media also reveals that the Gothic mode is itself qualified and modified by the subgenre to which it is employed. This raises the question of whether the Gothic can be understood as a mode in the same sense as, for example, the pastoral or the tragic, but also encourages further examination of the function of the Gothic as a set of transgeneric aesthetics. Priest asks, what are the implications of a loosely defined adjective that can associate texts as narratively and structurally diverse as Twilight and Black Mirror? Does Gothic signify too little here, or too much? Priest ultimately determines that the association of disparate texts through the use of the adjective Gothic allows for fruitful consideration of narrative and contextual concerns. Nevertheless, the term's slippery and playful evasion of definition results in it being an uncertain qualifier. The chapter concludes with this uncertainty that allows the Gothic to be truly transgeneric. Whether understood as a genre, mode, or aesthetic, Gothicness is something that can pervade, modify, and hybridize texts of all genres. The volume's last chapter further illuminates Whitaker's and Priest's assessments of Gothic transmedia and its transgeneric qualities. Ian McCormick's The State of Play, Transgressive Caricature, and Transnational Enlightenment is a provocative and timely reading of transnational geopolitical Gothic. McCormick investigates the dynamic Gothic dialectic that exists between civilization and barbarity. Within our transnational culture, the notion of a state of emergency, Walter Benjamin, or a state of exception, Giorgio Agamben, have become familiar terms. With this understanding, McCormick argues that the Gothic also has the potential to employ a state of play, explored through caricature, satire, and the monstrous, that reveals how bodies and nations transition to other ideological states, such as the body politic and the transnational, through a traumatic negotiation of postmodern enlightenment. The chapter surprisingly reveals the roots of these preoccupations in Swift's Gulliver's Travels, 1726, Tagore's Nationalism, 1917, and Alasdair Gray's Poor Things, 1992. The theoretical dimension of this wide-ranging chapter revisits the idea of transgression and a reconsideration of the opposition between margin and center, in terms of a deconstruction of their binary logic. Furthermore, the political dimension analyzes the opaqueness of the categories often employed in the stipulation of local, national, and supernatural clusters of power and influence. The final section of the chapter outlines the multiple and complex trajectories for the production and reception of caricature that modernity and postmodernity have inherited, and shows that they are the human remains of a presence and a supplement that evades direct observation. Here McCormick traces the lines of the unresolved tensions to shed light on the Gothic remainder of ideology. The chapter powerfully concludes with a discussion of the unresolved violence that inhabits the racial, ethnic, and religious conflicts that operate and mutate across divergent contemporary cultural scenes. Trans-Gothic and Literature and Culture seeks to organize and expand trans readings of the Gothic through this series of chapters that together consider Trans-Gothic as a global and transcultural manifestation of mobile gender identity. As McCormick's chapter points out, this trans-historical approach has arguably never been more pertinent than it is today, in the wake not only of globalization and rapid cultural dissemination, but also in the wake of recent political upheaval and tensions spawned by Brexit, the 2016 U.S. presidential election, and other political movements and shifts. As many critics have previously noted, Gothic literature and culture continually maps transnational, post-colonial, and racial concerns. It is the intention of this volume to continue this mapping as the chapters purposefully engage topics, theories, and subjects across disciplines. As presented through the chapters in this volume, a variety of trans-related topics can suggest new ways with which to understand the Gothic as a fertile location to question, reconsider, and reject the gender binary. Transing can function to open up a space that both intersects with, but also disturbs, non-trans feminist and queer readings of the Gothic. These subsequent overlaps and rifts take Gothic studies in what I believe are exciting and provocative directions. With this, we can explore categories such as transgender, transhumanism, and trans embodiments, but also broader concepts that move through and beyond the limits of gender identity and sexuality, such as trans histories, trans politics, trans modalities, and trans genres. Illuminating such areas like the appropriation of the trans body in Gothic literature and film, the function of trans rhetorics in memoir, textual markers of gender variance, and the Gothic's transgeneric qualities can begin to offer innovative, but not limited, ways to interpret the Gothic. Transing the Gothic necessarily identifies the trans body as a site for gender chaos and collective experiences of gender, but it also helps us extend our readings beyond the relationship of bodies and identities that so often underlie existing feminist, queer, and trans studies. In this sense, the trans approach doesn't necessarily reject the Gothic as a privileged site of queerness. Instead, it offers a denaturalizing or redirecting of this association. Trans-Gothic in literature and culture provocatively reasserts and returns the Gothic's placement on the margins, and offers readings that destabilize and reframe a binary-driven, boundary-crossing genre. I hope that reading the Gothic as a trans subject can offer new potential connections and insights, as well as interpretive rifts and disruptions as we pursue Gothic studies.